This is my true story. My 12 sons left me at a hospital emergency room and drove away without looking back, abandoning their sick elderly father because taking care of me was too much trouble for their comfortable lives. I raised them alone after their mother died when they were young, sacrificed everything to give them good educations and successful futures, and they repaid me by dumping me at a hospital like I was trash they needed to get rid of. 3 days later, they received one phone call from my lawyer that destroyed their life. But you won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. I raised my 12 sons completely alone after their mother died in a car accident, when the oldest was 15 and the youngest was only 2 years old. 12 young boys who suddenly had no mother and only me to depend on for everything they would need to survive and thrive in a world that had just become infinitely harder and more painful. Their mother's death devastated me in ways I still can't fully articulate, even after all these years. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart, because I had 12 children who needed me to be strong, who needed me to be both mother and father, who needed me to somehow fill a void that could never really be filled, no matter how hard I tried. I worked 3 jobs for most of their childhood, starting before dawn and finishing long after they had gone to bed, pushing my body to limits I didn't know existed just to make sure they had food on the table and clothes on their backs and a roof over their heads for all 12 of them. I worked construction during the day, the same back-breaking physical labor that eventually destroyed my knees and my back and my hands. Then I worked security at a warehouse 4 nights a week, and on weekends I did odd jobs for neighbors and friends who needed repairs or renovations and were willing to pay cash. I was exhausted every single day, so tired that sometimes I would fall asleep in my truck during lunch breaks, but I kept going because my 12 sons needed me, and I was determined not to fail them the way life had failed us by taking their mother. Feeding 12 growing boys was like trying to fill a bottomless pit. The grocery bills alone were staggering, and I had to plan every meal carefully to stretch every dollar as far as it would go without leaving anyone hungry. I bought food in bulk, cooked huge pots of pasta and rice and beans, made sandwiches assembly line style every morning for their school lunches, and I did it all while working 3 jobs and getting maybe 4 hours of sleep a night if I was lucky. Clothing 12 boys meant constant trips to thrift stores, and hand-me-downs passed from oldest to youngest until the fabric literally fell apart, and shoes wore out so fast I sometimes felt like I was buying new ones every other week for someone. I used the money I earned from those 3 jobs to start a small construction company, just me and a used truck and some basic tools at first, but slowly I built it into something real and successful through decades of hard work and sacrifice and smart decisions. By the time I was 60 years old, I had a legitimate business with multiple crews and major contracts and a reputation for quality work, and I had accumulated assets worth about $4 million, including properties and equipment and investments. Everything I built was for my 12 sons. Every dollar I earned was meant to give them security and opportunity. Every sacrifice I made was in service of creating a legacy they could inherit and divide among themselves to build comfortable lives. I paid for all 12 of them to go to college, some to community colleges and trade schools, and others to universities. Whatever path each one chose, I funded it because I believed education was the key to their success and their escape from poverty. The cost was astronomical. Putting 12 children through higher education nearly bankrupted me several times, but I took out loans and worked extra jobs and did whatever was necessary to make sure every single one of them got their degree. They all graduated and found good jobs, became successful men with careers and families, living comfortable middle-class lives that I had made possible through decades of sacrifice they seemed to have completely forgotten about. I helped all 12 of them with down payments on their first houses, gave them money for their weddings, bought them cars when they needed transportation, was always there whenever any of them needed financial help or support. I believed that when I got old and frail, when my body finally gave out after decades of providing for 12 children, that at least some of them would be there for me. I was catastrophically wrong. As I grew older and my body began to fail after decades of punishing physical labor that had destroyed my joints and my back and my hands, my 12 sons gradually became distant and cold in ways that broke my heart more than any physical pain ever could. The visits that used to happen regularly became less frequent, then rare, then almost non-existent, as they all claimed to be too busy with their jobs and their families and their own lives to spend time with the father who had sacrificed everything to give them those comfortable lives in the first place. The phone calls stopped coming except when they needed something from me, usually money or advice or help with some problem they expected me to solve despite my advancing age and declining health. I started needing help with basic tasks around the age of 70. Simple things that I used to do without thinking suddenly became difficult or impossible as my knees gave out and my back seized up and my hands shook too much to grip tools properly. Walking became painful and required a cane, then a walker, then sometimes a wheelchair on my worst days when my legs simply refused to support my weight anymore. I couldn't drive safely anymore after a couple of close calls where my reaction time was too slow, couldn't cook elaborate meals because standing at the stove exhausted me, couldn't maintain my house the way I used to because climbing ladders and lifting heavy objects were beyond my physical capabilities. I called my sons asking for help with simple things, asking if someone could drive me to doctor appointments or help me change a light bulb I couldn't reach or fix a leaking faucet that required strength I no longer possessed. They complained every single time, sighing heavily into the phone like I was asking them to move mountains instead of spending an hour helping the father who had spent decades working 3 jobs to raise them. They would say they were too busy with work, too tired from their own responsibilities, too overwhelmed with their own families to spare any time or energy for me. And I would hang up the phone feeling like a burden that nobody wanted to carry. When they did visit, which was maybe once every few months if I was lucky, they treated me with barely concealed impatience and irritation, checking their watches constantly and making excuses to leave as quickly as possible. They would sit in my living room looking uncomfortable, making small talk that felt forced and artificial, clearly counting the minutes until they could escape back to their own lives and forget about their aging father for another few months. I could see in their eyes that they found me embarrassing, that my slow shuffling walk and my trembling hands and my forgetfulness made them uncomfortable, that they wished I would just stay out of sight and not remind them that they too would someday be old and dependent. I asked if I could come live with one of them when it became clear I could no longer safely live alone, rotating between their houses maybe, spending a few months with each family so I wouldn't be a burden on any single household for too long. All 12 of them said no, gave me different excuses, but the message was the same. They didn't want me in their homes disrupting their comfortable routines with my medical needs and my physical limitations and my presence that apparently embarrassed them in front of their friends and neighbors. One son said his house was too small, even though it had 5 bedrooms. Another said his wife wouldn't be comfortable with it. Another claimed his kids needed their space, and the excuses kept coming until I understood clearly that none of them wanted me. The boys I had raised, the children I had fed and clothed and educated through decades of backbreaking work and financial sacrifice, had become strangers who shared my blood but felt no love or loyalty or obligation toward me. They had taken everything I gave them, used it to build successful lives for themselves, and now that I was old and weak and needed help, they saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience they wished would disappear. I was their father, but I had become their burden, and they made it painfully clear through their coldness and their distance and their excuses that they wanted nothing to do with taking care of me the way I had taken care of them. One morning, I woke up with crushing chest pain that radiated down my left arm and made it impossible to breathe properly. The kind of pain that immediately tells you something is seriously wrong and you need medical help immediately, or you might die right there in your own bed. I managed to reach my phone and call my oldest son, the one who lived closest to me, gasping into the phone that I was having chest pains and needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible. He arrived about 30 minutes later, not rushing, not panicking, just showing up like this was a minor inconvenience rather than a medical emergency involving his elderly father who might be having a heart attack. He helped me into his car without much gentleness, practically dragging me because I could barely walk from the pain and the fear and the difficulty breathing, and he drove to the hospital in silence while I clutched my chest and wondered if I was going to die before we got there. He didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't try to comfort me or reassure me, didn't call any of his 11 brothers to let them know what was happening, just drove with his jaw clenched like he was angry at me for getting sick and disrupting his day. I wanted to say something about his coldness, but I couldn't speak, couldn't get enough air into my lungs to form words. So I just sat there suffering while my own son acted like driving his dying father to the emergency room was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. We arrived at the hospital, and he pulled up to the emergency room entrance, helped me out of the car with the same rough impatience he had shown getting me in, and walked me through the automatic doors to the check-in desk where nurses immediately saw how much distress I was in and rushed to get me into a wheelchair. My son spoke to the admission clerk, gave them my information, signed some papers, and I thought he would stay with me like any decent child would stay with their parent during a medical emergency. But instead, he looked at me sitting in that wheelchair struggling to breathe, and he said, "We'll be back." Those exact words. "We'll be back." And then he turned around and walked toward the exit. I watched him leave through those automatic doors, heard them whoosh shut behind him, heard his car engine start in the parking lot outside, and I realized with a sinking feeling in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition that he was lying. He wasn't coming back. None of them were coming back. I had just been dropped off like a piece of luggage that was too heavy to carry anymore. The nurses wheeled me back to an examination room, hooked me up to monitors and IVs, ran tests and took blood samples, and through all of it I kept thinking surely one of my sons would show up soon. Surely they wouldn't just abandon me here alone during what might be my final hours. They admitted me for observation, concerned about my heart and wanting to run more tests, and they moved me to a regular hospital room where I would spend the next several days. I asked the nurse if I could use a phone to call my family, thinking maybe my oldest son had just been confused about the severity of my condition. Maybe he didn't realize they were keeping me overnight. Maybe if I explained the situation properly, some of my 12 sons would come to sit with me. The nurse brought me a phone, and I called all 12 of them, one after another, leaving messages when they didn't answer, and explaining to the ones who did pick up that I was in the hospital, that the doctors were concerned about my heart, that I was scared and alone and really needed someone to be with me. Not one of them came. Not that first day. Not that first night when I lay awake in the dark, listening to monitors beep and wondering if I was going to die surrounded by strangers. I had raised 12 sons, given them everything I had for decades. And when I needed them most, they all decided I wasn't worth an hour of their time. I lay in that hospital bed for 3 days straight, connected to an IV that dripped fluids into my arm and monitors that tracked my heartbeat and blood pressure with electronic precision, and not a single one of my 12 sons walked through that door to check on me or ask how I was feeling or sit with me for even a few minutes. The first day I kept watching the door expecting someone to arrive, kept thinking there must be some explanation for why they weren't here yet, kept making excuses in my mind about traffic or work emergencies or miscommunication that would explain their absence. But as the hours ticked by and visiting hours came and went with no visitors for me, the excuses started sounding hollow, even to my own desperate mind. The second day, I stopped watching the door quite as hopefully, the disappointment settling into my chest heavier than the heart condition that had brought me here in the first place. I listened to families visiting other patients in nearby rooms, heard laughter and conversation and the sounds of people who were loved checking on their sick relatives, and I felt a loneliness so profound it was almost physical. The nurses started looking at me with pity in their eyes, these strangers who were caring for me with more compassion than my own children had shown, and I could see them wondering what kind of family abandons an elderly man in a hospital without even a phone call to see if he's still alive. The third day, I stopped expecting anyone at all, accepted fully that my 12 sons had dumped me here and moved on with their lives without a backward glance, and the acceptance of this reality hurt worse than any physical pain the doctors could treat with medication. I had no visitors during 3 entire days, no phone calls checking on my condition, no flowers or cards or any sign that anyone in the world cared whether I lived or died in this sterile room. The nurses kept asking if they could call someone for me, if there was any family member who should be notified about my condition, and I had to tell them again and again that yes, I have 12 sons, but no, they aren't coming, and no, I don't know why. I watched other patients get discharged with family members who helped them gather their belongings and walked them out to cars and took them home to continue recovering in comfortable, familiar surroundings, and I wondered what would happen to me when the doctors decided I was well enough to leave. Would any of my sons come pick me up, or would the hospital have to arrange some kind of medical transport to take me back to my empty house where I would continue being alone and forgotten? The social worker came to talk to me about my home situation, gently probing to understand why a man with 12 adult children had absolutely no one visiting him or helping him, and I had no good answer to give her because I didn't understand it myself. I spent those 3 days thinking about my entire life, about the decades I worked 3 jobs to feed 12 hungry boys, about the sacrifices I made, and the exhaustion I endured, and the love I poured into raising them to be good men who would succeed in life. I thought about every meal I cooked, every school event I attended despite being dead tired from work, every time I went without so they could have more, every penny I spent on their education and their futures. And this was how they repaid me, by leaving me alone in a hospital for 3 days without even bothering to check if their father was still breathing. By the 3rd day, something inside me had changed. The hurt and disappointment transforming into something harder and colder and more determined. I realized that I had wasted my entire life loving children who didn't love me back, providing for people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money and support that they no longer needed now that they were successful adults. My 12 sons had shown me exactly what I meant to them, and lying in that hospital bed for 72 hours with no visitors gave me plenty of time to decide what I was going to do about it. On the 3rd day of lying alone in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines and silence and the crushing weight of being abandoned by all 12 of the children I had devoted my entire life to raising, I made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives and finally deliver the justice that my ungrateful sons so richly deserved. I asked the nurse if I could make a phone call, not to any of my sons who had made it abundantly clear they wanted nothing to do with me, but to my lawyer who had handled my business affairs and estate planning for over 20 years. My voice was weak when he answered, weakened by 3 days of stress and heartbreak and the medications they had been pumping into my system, but my resolve was stronger than it had ever been in my entire life. I told him what had happened, explained how my oldest son had dropped me at the emergency room and driven away, promising to come back, but never did, described the 3 days I had spent alone without a single visitor or phone call from any of my 12 children, and I could hear the shock and anger in his voice as he processed what I was telling him. He had known my sons for years, had met them at various business meetings and family events, had probably assumed like everyone else that I was a lucky man to have such a large family who would certainly take care of me in my old age. Now he was learning the truth about who they really were, and I could tell from his tone that he was disgusted by their behavior, even though he was too professional to say so directly. I told him I wanted to change my will immediately, wanted to remove every single one of my 12 sons from any inheritance they thought they were going to receive, wanted to erase them completely from my estate the same way they had tried to erase me from their lives by abandoning me in this hospital. He asked if I was certain, said these were major decisions that would have permanent consequences, suggested that maybe I should wait until I was feeling better and thinking more clearly before making such drastic changes. But I told him my thinking had never been clearer, that 3 days alone in a hospital bed with plenty of time to reflect had shown me exactly who my sons were and what they deserved, and what they deserved was absolutely nothing. He said he would come to the hospital immediately, that he could bring the necessary paperwork and witnesses to make the changes legal and binding, even though I was currently a patient in a medical facility. I told him to hurry because I didn't know how much longer they would keep me here, and I wanted this done before any of my sons suddenly remembered I existed and tried to show up pretending to care about my well-being. Within 2 hours, my lawyer arrived with his briefcase full of documents, accompanied by 2 witnesses he had brought along to make everything official and legally uncontestable in any future court proceedings my sons might attempt. We worked for over an hour going through my entire estate, my $4 million in assets that included multiple properties and business holdings and investment accounts and cash reserves, and systematically removing my 12 sons from every single line where their names appeared as beneficiaries. Each time I crossed out a name, it felt like removing a weight from my chest, like finally taking action after years of accepting mistreatment and hoping things would improve. And by the time we finished, not one of my sons would inherit so much as $1 from the fortune I had built through decades of sacrifice. My lawyer asked what I wanted to do with the money instead, and I told him to donate everything to charities that help abandoned elderly people, organizations that support seniors whose families have discarded them, causes that would do actual good in the world instead of enriching 12 ungrateful children who had proven they cared about nothing except my money. I signed every page with a trembling hand, my signature witnessed and notarized right there in my hospital room, and when we finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt powerful, felt like I had finally taken control of my own life instead of being a victim of my son's cruelty. And I knew that what came next would destroy their comfortable assumptions about their futures. My lawyer spread all the documents across the small table next to my hospital bed, page after page of legal paperwork that represented the complete dismantling of everything my 12 sons had been counting on inheriting when I died. We went through every single asset I owned with meticulous care, making sure nothing was overlooked, making sure there were no loopholes they could exploit later, making sure the message was absolutely clear that they were getting nothing because they had given me nothing when I needed them most. The main family house where I had raised all 12 of them, the house I had paid off through decades of mortgage payments while working multiple jobs, would be donated to a homeless shelter that provided housing for elderly people who had nowhere else to go. The construction company I had built from nothing, the business that had grown from just me and a used truck into a legitimate operation worth over $1 million, would be sold and the proceeds distributed among 3 different charities that focused on elder care and support for abandoned seniors. My 12 sons had all assumed they would inherit equal shares of the business, had probably already been planning how they would divide it up or sell it off and pocket the money. But now they would watch it benefit complete strangers instead of padding their already comfortable bank accounts. The thought of their faces when they learned this particular detail gave me a grim satisfaction that I wasn't ashamed to feel. The investment properties I owned, 4 rental houses and 2 commercial buildings that generated steady income every month, would all go to organizations that provided affordable housing for low-income seniors who were struggling to survive on fixed incomes. I had originally planned to leave these properties to my sons so they would have passive income to supplement their careers. But now, those buildings would serve people who actually deserved help instead of entitled children who had abandoned their father in a hospital. Each property represented years of saving and careful investment, and crossing my sons' names off the deeds felt like erasing them from my life, the way they had tried to erase me from theirs. My bank accounts, several $100,000 in liquid assets that I had accumulated through a lifetime of frugal living and smart financial decisions, would be split between organizations that fought elder abuse and neglect, groups that provided legal assistance to seniors who had been mistreated by their families, and charities that offered companionship programs for isolated elderly people who had no one to visit them. Every dollar that my sons had been mentally spending for years, every penny they had counted on receiving to pay off their mortgages or fund their children's educations or finance their retirement plans, would now go to causes that actually mattered instead of lining the pockets of 12 people who had proven they didn't deserve my generosity. The personal items of value, my late wife's jewelry that her sons had always assumed would be divided among their wives, my collection of tools and equipment that represented decades in the construction business, even my vehicle and furniture and everything else of monetary worth, would be sold at auction with proceeds going to the same charitable organizations. I wanted nothing left for them to claim, no inheritance however small, no family heirlooms they could fight over, nothing that would allow them to profit in any way from my death. My 12 sons would walk away from my funeral with empty hands and the knowledge that they had gambled on my death, making them richer, and lost everything. My lawyer reviewed every change with me multiple times, making absolutely certain I understood the implications and consequences of what I was doing, that this would likely destroy whatever remained of my relationships with my children, that there would be no going back once these documents were signed and witnessed. I told him I understood perfectly that there was no relationship left to destroy because my sons had already destroyed it by leaving me alone in this hospital for 3 days. That I was simply making official what they had already made clear through their actions. He nodded and handed me the pen, and I signed my name 12 times, once for each son I was removing from my life and my legacy. and I felt no regret whatsoever about the devastation I was about to unleash on their futures. 3 days after I signed the new will and all the paperwork was properly filed and notarized and made legally binding in ways that no court challenge could overturn, my lawyer made 12 phone calls that would destroy the comfortable futures my sons had been planning without ever bothering to earn through love or loyalty or basic human decency toward their father. He called each one individually, identified himself as my attorney, and delivered the news in the professional, emotionless tone that lawyers use when communicating information that will devastate the recipient, but that they have no personal stake in. He told each of my sons that I had made significant changes to my estate planning while hospitalized, that they had been completely and permanently removed as beneficiaries, that the $4 million estate they had been counting on inheriting would be distributed to various charitable organizations instead, and that they would receive exactly $0 and zero property when I eventually died. The silence on those phone lines must have been absolutely deafening, as 12 different men in 12 different locations processed the information they were hearing and tried to understand how their financial futures had just been completely erased by a father they had abandoned in a hospital emergency room. My lawyer told me later that some of them initially thought it was a joke or a mistake, laughed nervously, and asked him to repeat what he had just said because surely they had misheard something so absurd. But when he repeated the information in the same calm, professional voice, when he confirmed that yes, this was real, and yes, it was permanent, and yes, I had been completely lucid and competent when I signed the documents, the reality began to sink in, and the panic began to set in with it. Some of them immediately demanded to speak to me directly, insisted that there must be some misunderstanding that could be cleared up if they could just talk to their father and explain whatever had gone wrong. My lawyer informed them that I had specifically instructed him not to provide my contact information, that I had made it clear I did not wish to speak with any of them, that the decision was final and no amount of conversation would change my mind about what I had done. Others immediately threatened legal action, said they would contest the will, said they would hire their own lawyers and fight this in court. But my lawyer calmly explained that the will had been properly executed with witnesses and notarization, that I had been evaluated by hospital staff and found to be of sound mind, and that any legal challenge would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. A few of them broke down on the phone, their voices cracking as they realized the magnitude of what they had lost. Not just the money, but the relationship with their father that they had taken for granted for so long. My lawyer said one of them actually started crying, asking how this could have happened, saying he didn't understand what he had done wrong to deserve being cut out of the inheritance. My lawyer reminded him that I had spent 3 days alone in a hospital without a single visitor or phone call from any of my 12 sons, and the crying stopped abruptly as the son realized exactly what he had done wrong and exactly why he was being punished for it. The phone calls lasted about 10 minutes each, my lawyer patiently answering questions and deflecting threats and refusing to negotiate or compromise on anything I had decided. By the time he finished making all 12 calls, by the time he had systematically destroyed 12 sets of expectations and plans and financial assumptions, he called me and reported that the news had been delivered and the reactions had been everything we expected. Some were angry, some were devastated, some were in complete denial. But all of them now knew that the father they had abandoned still had the power to destroy their greedy dreams with a few signatures on legal documents. He asked if I wanted him to accept calls from any of them if they tried to reach me through his office, and I told him absolutely not, that I had nothing to say to any of them, that they had made their choice when they left me alone in that hospital, and now they would live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of their lives. Within 1 hour of my lawyer finishing those 12 phone calls, my own phone exploded with activity in a way it hadn't in years, suddenly flooded with calls and voicemails and text messages from sons who had apparently remembered I existed the moment they learned their inheritance had vanished. The hospital phone in my room started ringing constantly, the nurses looking confused about why a patient who had received 0 calls for 3 days was suddenly the most popular person in the building, and my cell phone vibrated so continuously with incoming messages that I had to turn it off just to get some peace. All 12 of them suddenly cared whether I was alive or dead, suddenly wanted to talk to their father, suddenly remembered they had a parent lying in a hospital bed. but their concern arrived several days too late to mean anything. The voicemails they left were pathetic in their desperation and transparent in their motivation, each one following roughly the same script of fake apologies and hollow excuses designed to manipulate me into changing my mind about the will. They said they were so sorry for not visiting, said they had been busy with work and family obligations, said they didn't realize I was seriously ill or they would have come immediately, said there must have been some miscommunication about how long I was going to be in the hospital. The lies came so easily to them, the excuses flowing like they had practiced them. But every word rang false because I knew the truth about why they hadn't come, and it had nothing to do with miscommunication or busy schedules. They begged me not to do this, pleaded with me to reconsider, promised they would be better sons from now on if I would just give them another chance and restore them to the will. One son left a message saying he had always loved me and always would. That family was the most important thing in the world to him. Words that might have meant something if he had shown up even once during the 3 days I spent alone in that hospital. Another son said he was sorry if I felt neglected, but that I had to understand how demanding his job was, how much his children needed him, how difficult it was to balance everything, as if my needs were somehow less important than his convenience. The text messages were even worse, dozens of them coming in rapid succession, some of them angry and accusatory, others syrupy sweet and manipulative. All of them focused on the money I had just taken away from them, rather than any genuine concern for my health or well-being. One son texted that this wasn't fair, that he had been counting on that inheritance to pay off his mortgage, that I was ruining his financial plans by changing the will. Another texted that I was being cruel and vindictive, that I was punishing them for a simple mistake, that parents were supposed to forgive their children no matter what. The entitlement in their messages was stunning. The assumption that they deserved my money regardless of how they treated me. The belief that being my biological children entitled them to my estate even after abandoning me in a hospital. Several of them showed up at the hospital together within a few hours of getting the news, tracking down which room I was in despite my instructions to the nurses not to give out that information. And they stood in my doorway looking panicked and desperate in a way I had never seen before. They didn't come because they loved me or because they were worried about my health. They came because $4 million had just disappeared from their futures, and they were terrified about what that meant for their comfortable lives. I could see the calculation in their eyes, the mental math they were doing about how much money they had just lost, the panic about mortgages and college funds and retirement plans that had just been thrown into chaos. But I looked at each of their faces. These 12 men I had raised and sacrificed everything for, and I felt nothing but disgust for what they had become, and relief that I had finally found the courage to stop enabling their greed and cruelty. Their concern had come 3 days too late, triggered not by love, but by the loss of money they had never earned, and I had no intention of rewarding their transparent manipulation by changing anything I had done. They crowded into my hospital room, all 12 of them together, a group so large that nurses had to ask some of them to wait in the hallway because there simply wasn't space for that many adult men in a room designed for one patient and maybe 2 visitors. The ones who made it inside surrounded my bed with expressions that ranged from desperate pleading to barely contained anger, and I realized this was the most attention I had received from my children in probably a decade. All of it motivated by money, rather than love or concern for their elderly father lying in a hospital bed. They started talking over each other, voices rising as they competed to be heard, each one trying to convince me to undo what I had done and restore their names to the will that would determine their financial futures. My oldest son spoke first, the same one who had dropped me at this hospital 3 days ago and driven away without a backward glance. And he had the audacity to say he was sorry for leaving me here alone, but that he had assumed the hospital staff would take care of me, and he didn't realize I would need family present. I stared at him without speaking, letting him hear how hollow his excuse sounded when spoken out loud to the father he had abandoned during a medical emergency. He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, and then quickly moved to what really mattered to him, asking if we could talk about the will, saying there must have been some mistake, insisting that I couldn't possibly mean to cut out my own sons from everything I had worked my entire life to build. Another son, the one who had always been particularly good at manipulation, tried a different approach and started crying while telling me how much he loved me. How devastated he was to learn I thought they didn't care about me. How he would do anything to prove his devotion if I would just give him another chance. The tears looked real enough, but I had seen this performance before over the years, seen him cry to get out of trouble or to manipulate his way into getting what he wanted, and I was unmoved by the display. I asked him why he hadn't visited during the 3 days I was here if he loved me so much. Why his love only appeared after he learned he was removed from the will, and he had no answer that didn't make him look exactly as selfish as he was. The others chimed in with their own versions of the same script, each one promising to be a better son from now on, each one swearing they would visit regularly and help with whatever I needed, each one making commitments they had no intention of keeping beyond whatever time it took to get back into my will. One son promised to have me over for dinner every Sunday. Another offered to move me into his house so I wouldn't have to live alone anymore. Another said he would call every single day to check on me, and listening to them make these empty promises felt like being insulted all over again because they clearly thought I was stupid enough to believe them. I let them talk until they ran out of words, let them beg and plead and make their desperate cases for why I should restore their inheritance. And then I spoke for the first time since they had invaded my hospital room. I told them that 3 days was a long time to lie alone in a hospital bed, long enough to think very clearly about who really cared about me and who only cared about my money, long enough to understand that the family I thought I had was an illusion I had been maintaining through financial generosity rather than genuine love. I told them that their presence here now, their sudden concern and their promises and their tears proved exactly what I already knew, that they valued my $4 million estate far more than they valued the man who had earned it through decades of sacrifice for their benefit. They tried to argue, tried to convince me I was wrong about their motivations, but I held up my hand for silence and told them I wanted all of them to leave immediately, that I had nothing more to say to any of them, that the decision was final and no amount of begging would change my mind. They left reluctantly, still trying to speak, still trying to negotiate, but I closed my eyes and refused to acknowledge them until they finally gave up and filed out of my room one by one. I recovered from my heart condition and was discharged from the hospital after a week of treatment and observation. But I didn't go back to the house where I had raised 12 sons who turned out to be strangers interested only in my money. Instead, I moved directly into a senior living facility that provided round-the-clock care and support, a place where the staff treated me with more kindness and respect in one day than my own children had shown me in the last decade of my life. The facility was comfortable and clean, with nurses who checked on me regularly, not because they were obligated by blood, but because it was their job and they actually cared about doing it well. I had my own apartment with a bedroom and small living area. Meals were provided in a communal dining room where I met other seniors who had similar stories of family disappointment. And for the first time in years, I felt safe and cared for. My 12 sons continued calling and texting and showing up at the facility begging to see me, their desperation growing as weeks turned into months, and they realized I was serious about cutting them out of my life completely. The staff had instructions not to let any of them up to my apartment without my permission, and I never gave that permission because I had nothing to say to people who had proven their love was conditional on financial benefit. They left messages that ranged from angry accusations to tearful apologies, from threats of legal action to promises of changed behavior, but none of it mattered because I had heard their true feelings loud and clear when they abandoned me in that hospital. Some of them sent letters, long rambling explanations of why they deserved another chance, but I threw them away without reading past the first paragraph because their words meant nothing compared to their actions. They lost $4 million in inheritance because they couldn't be bothered to visit their father for 3 days while he was hospitalized with a potentially life-threatening heart condition, and I hoped that loss haunted them every single day for the rest of their lives. $4 million divided 12 ways would have given each of them over $300,000, enough to pay off mortgages, fund their children's educations, retire comfortably, live without financial stress. But they gambled all of that on the assumption that their father would always be there as a safety net, no matter how badly they treated him. They were wrong, and their greed cost them everything they had been counting on, and I felt absolutely no guilt about the devastation I had caused to their financial plans. The money I had worked my entire life to accumulate, the fortune I had built through 3 jobs and decades of sacrifice and smart business decisions, was now serving people who actually needed it rather than entitled children who already had successful careers and comfortable lives. Organizations that helped abandoned elderly people, charities that fought elder abuse, programs that provided companionship to isolated seniors, all of them benefiting from my estate while my 12 sons got exactly what they gave me, which was nothing. The irony was perfect, the justice was complete, and I slept peacefully every night knowing I had made the right decision. My sons learned too late that the father they had dismissed as a burden and an inconvenience still had the power to destroy their expectations with a few signatures on legal documents, that abandoning me in a hospital had consequences they never imagined when they drove away that day. They kept calling, kept begging, kept promising to be better if I would just change my mind. But their pleas fell on deaf ears because I had finally learned what they should have known all along, that love and loyalty can't be bought back with apologies after they've been destroyed by cruelty and neglect. I made one phone call to my lawyer from a hospital bed where I lay alone for 3 days, and that single call changed 12 lives forever, erasing $4 million from their futures and teaching them that even an old man they thought was powerless still had one devastating weapon left to use against the children who betrayed him.